In Eastern philosophy, there's a symbol I'm sure you've seen before. It's called yin and yang, and it represents the opposite and opposing forces we see at work in the world. So this week, as I was looking into it, I discovered, I didn't know this, that the yin represents rest, and the yang represents movement. And of course, we need both of those in the world. They're both necessary. And there are lots of other examples of yin and yang as well. Day and night, hot and cold, masculine and feminine. For the world to be healthy, those opposite, opposing forces need to be in balance. And I think something similar is true in terms of politics and governing. In modern America, when we think of right and left, which is kind of what we've been talking about in our new sermon series, we automatically think Republican and Democrat. But the binary of conservative and liberal is much older than that. It's been around a long, long time. And we see it even in stories of the Bible. One of my favorite examples has to do with a conflict that arose in the early church between two groups of followers of Jesus, right? Two groups of Christians. And it regarded the eating of meat sacrificed in pagan temples. That's what the conflict was about. And one of the reasons I like this illustration is because it's so far removed from anything we might be fighting about right now that no one is likely to be offended by it. Makes it a great illustration. However, when we break down the arguments and really take a look at them, it's easy to see why people thought the way they did. So on the one hand, there was a group of disciples that I would label as conservative. They held that believers should refrain from eating meat sacrificed in pagan temples, right? That's where idolatry is practiced. They should stay away from it. It was a principle for them, and there were many in the early church who agreed, maybe half of them. On the other hand, there was another group I would label as liberal. They were more permissive about stuff like that. They thought, meat is meat. Doesn't matter where it comes from, right? Meat is meat. Doesn't matter if some pagan priest prayed over it. As long as you eat it with a thankful heart, no harm, no foul. No problem. Now, unfortunately, these two groups of disciples came into conflict. The conservatives called the liberals sinners and idolaters for eating meat sacrificed in pagan temples. And the liberals called the conservatives weak because they felt like their faith wasn't strong enough to get them past that trivial thing about it being sacrificed in a pagan temple. Now, the reason we know about this church spat and many others in the New Testament is because the Apostle Paul addressed it in one of his letters. In this case, it's in the first letter to the Corinthian church. And there's a whole chapter about it. You can look it up, read about it yourself. It's in chapter 8 of 1 Corinthians. So instead of saying that one group was right and the other group was wrong, which of course is what both groups wanted, right? They wanted Paul to agree with them and say, you're right, you're wrong. But Paul didn't do that. Paul didn't go right or left, conservative or liberal. Instead, Paul found an answer to this conflict in the way of Jesus. He said in the very first verse of 1 Corinthians chapter 8, now concerning food sacrificed to idols. Okay, so anytime Paul says something like that, you can be sure that he's addressing a question or a conflict that's come up in the church. And we're going to see that again in a minute. Now, concerning food sacrificed to idols, we know that all of us possess knowledge. He's quoting something there, somebody. That's why you've got those little quotation marks there. Knowledge puffs up, he says, but love builds up. And then Paul goes on to say what that looks like in the church regarding this issue. And Paul's advice was really simple. Let love be your guide. And where it comes down is this: if eating meat sacrificed to idols offends the conscience of your brothers and sisters in the church, then when you're with them, don't do it. There you go. That's it. Pretty simple. I've seen the scripture applied to alcohol consumption too, for modern Christians like us. And I have to imagine Paul's advice for us on this subject would be very similar to the advice he gave to those Christians in Corinth. You might not consider drinking alcoholic beverages a sin. But if you know people who do, and you probably do, don't do it when you're with them, right? Not that hard. Let love be your guide. For Paul and for Jesus before him, love was the answer to just about everything. If I had to summarize the way of Jesus in one word, love would be it. No doubt about it. And we're going to focus on what that kind of agape love looks like next week. Because there's different kinds of love. In Greek, there's I don't know how many different words for it, 4 or 5 different words for it. We're going to be looking at what that word means. This week, however, we're going to dig a little bit deeper into the dysfunction and division of the Corinthian church. Because there's a lot there. I mean, that's why Paul wrote this letter in particular. And that dysfunction and division goes way beyond the conflict regarding the eating of meat sacrificed to idols. As you've heard me say before, one of the reasons I love the Bible is because it tells the truth about the world. And it tells the truth about us. And the truth is this: people will divide up into opposing factions and fight over almost anything. That's the truth. We all know it. When I read 1 Corinthians, I honestly feel sorry for Paul, who had to take care of these people. After successfully fighting off the Judaizers, you've probably heard me talk about the Judaizers in other sermons. These were Jewish Christians, okay? They were Jewish first before they were Christians, and they believed that Gentile Christians, those who weren't Jewish, should have to follow Jewish law. All of it. Circumcision, kosher, diets, all of that. Well, he finally got that issue settled, right? And after all that, in Corinth, he may have thought that things were going to be easier. After all, they all had similar backgrounds. They were mostly Gentile, which meant they didn't have that Jewish background to unpack. They were all baptized, Spirit-filled, followers of the way. But of course, people will be people. Even though the folks in Corinth had a lot in common, they also had a lot of differences. For instance, there was rich and poor. We know one of the things they struggled with in that church was that they would get together for a love feast, right? Where they would take communion, but they'd also have like a potluck together. Well, the rich folks that didn't have to work, they were showing up early, eating all the food, drinking all the wine, and getting drunk. And then the poor folks would show up and there wouldn't be anything for them. That was one issue. Of course, there were male and female, slave and free, conservative and liberal, as we've already seen. There was enough diversity in that church that there was bound to be conflict. And strangely enough, when that conflict finally raised its ugly head, it had to do with spiritual gifts. Last thing I would have guessed would have been a problem. But this was it. So in this church, some of the more charismatic members, they believed that their gift of speaking in tongues should give them higher status in the church than everyone else. And of course, those who didn't display that particular gift disagreed. So once again, we see Paul doing his best to steer a course that didn't go in too much in one direction or the other. What we see in 1 Corinthians 12, which is the chapter we're going to be reading from, is a gifted pastor, I think, seeking to help his friends chart a way in the way of Jesus, to find and live in that way. And so we read in 1 Corinthians 12, now notice in the very first verse, now concerning spiritual gifts, right? Now concerning the eating of meat sacrificed to idols. Now, concerning spiritual gifts, brothers and sisters, I do not want you to be uninformed. Now, there are varieties of gifts, but the same Spirit. And there are varieties of services, but the same Lord. And there are varieties of activities, but it is the same God who activates all of them in everyone. To each is given the manifestation of the Spirit for the common good. To one is given through the Spirit the utterance of wisdom, and to another the utterance of knowledge according to the same Spirit. To another faith by the same Spirit. To another gifts of healing by the one Spirit. To another the working of miracles. To another prophecy. To another the discernment of spirits. To another various kinds of tongues. To another the interpretation of tongues. All these are activated by one and the same Spirit, who allots to each one individually just as the Spirit chooses. For just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members of the body, though many, are one body, so it is with Christ. For in the one Spirit we were all baptized into one body. Jews or Greeks, slaves or free, we were all made to drink of the one Spirit. Today we might add to those binaries that Paul lists there at the end, to the yin and yang of the church. Instead of Jews or Greeks and slaves or free, we might add right or left, old or young, urban or rural, and the list could go on. Because as much as we have in common, we're still a diverse crowd, not only in terms of our backgrounds, but also in terms of our gifts and talents. They're different too. As Paul said, we need everybody working together in order for the body to function. Now, I figured out a long time ago that I love to preach and teach. I believe God gave me this gift to use in service of the gospel and the church. And I can't believe I get to stand up in front of a congregation every week and talk about what's on my mind. I am blessed to be able to do that. But I also know that if others aren't working alongside of me using their gifts, I'd be preaching to an empty room. There wouldn't be a church. It takes all of us working together in order to be the church God intends us to be, which means our differences aren't a liability. I want you to hear that. Our differences aren't a liability, they're a strength. It's what makes us powerful and effective in our mission, our differences. Last week in my sermon, when we started this series, I talked about the political forces that sometimes divide us. And I think maybe I might have given the impression that politics is somehow a bad thing. I hope that's not the case, because that is not what I believe. Like my calling to be a preacher and a teacher, I know that some of you are called to be engaged in that political process, right? That you're called to be public servants and even politicians. Many of you, I know, are involved in local political parties, and you work on behalf of social issues that are important to you, and that is exactly as it should be. It's one of the ways that you exercise the gifts and abilities that God has given you. About a week ago, I had the honor of officiating at the wedding of a state senator, an Iowa state senator, our own Jeff Reichman, who represents our area, and his lovely bride, Renee, who come to church here. The wedding was held in the rotunda of the state capitol building, and I had the honor of introducing Iowa's governor, who participated in the service. It was really quite something. Now, at one point in that day, right before the wedding, we were walking through the Senate chambers, which is where Jeff got ready, and then he had a friend there, another state senator, and we talked about what happens there in that Senate chamber. All of that push and pull of right and left that's been going on since our state was a state. And it's hardball, right? As they say, politics ain't beanbag. It can be intense. And I'm grateful for everyone who is called to serve in that way. The last thing I would want is to see disciples of Jesus pull away from public service and not engage in it anymore, because we need followers of the way in every level of the political process on both sides of the aisle. Now, of course, there will always be the occasional bad egg among politicians. We see those headlines, just like we see headlines about preachers, too, that go bad. That happens. Once again, the key to living faithfully is remembering what and who comes first. As one of my conservative friends said to me just this past week, when I walk into church, I am no longer a Republican, I'm a Christian. And everyone here is my friend, my brother and sister in Christ. And that's what it's about. God doesn't expect uniformity from us. God expects faithfulness and love. God expects us to work together despite our differences. This week I was reminded, there was an article popped up on Facebook. It seemed like it was pretty timely. And it reminded me that on the night of Jesus' betrayal and arrest, he went off by himself to pray. 3 of the Gospels tell us that. Matthew, Mark, and Luke all tell us that. John's Gospel, however, tells us what Jesus prayed for. And one of the things he prayed about that night was for the unity of his disciples. In John 17, verses 20 and 21, Jesus prays, I am praying not only for them, for the 12, right, that he just had the Last Supper with, but also for those who believe in me because of them and their witness about me. The goal is for all of them to become one heart and mind, just as you, Father, are in me and I in you, so they might be one heart and mind with us. Then the world might believe that you, in fact, sent me. On the night before Jesus' crucifixion, he prayed for the unity of his disciples. Not only then, but for us now. Jesus prayed for our unity because he knew that a fractious, angry, and divided church would be unbelievable to the world. Who would want to be a part of that? Who is going to believe Jesus' message of good news and take it seriously from a church that's fighting with itself? The church in Corinth was made up of a diverse body of believers, and so were we. We have different gifts and talents. We see the world in different ways. We sometimes vote in different ways. We come together around Jesus. Jesus is the one essential that binds us in the bonds of love and fellowship. And because of that, we have an opportunity to make an impact on the world. Our unity is a living testimony to the good news. The absence of our unity is a problem. Reminds me of a story about something that happened years ago in South Dakota when a little boy wandered away from his home. For 3 days, hundreds of volunteers moved through the prairie hoping to find the boy before he succumbed to the cold. On the morning of the 4th day, one of the searchers said, let's make one long line. Let's join hands and we'll sweep up and down the prairie. And so they did. They formed a line 1/4 of a mile long. On the 3rd sweep, they found him. Tragically, the cold had taken its toll. They found his body in a small ditch behind some brush. Gently, they picked up the boy's body and they carried him to where his mother was waiting. When they put the boy in his mother's arms, there was silence for a moment. And then she looked up and she said, why didn't you join hands sooner? I sometimes wonder if God doesn't say the same thing about us. He sees us fussing and fighting with each other while there are folks out there who are lost and may never be found. When Jesus prayed for the unity of his disciples, he didn't pray for conformity. He prayed that we might join hands and continue his work. That's what he prayed for. When Paul lectured the believers in Corinth, he didn't tell them they all had to look and act And think alike, he reminded them that their diversity was what God was counting on, because that's how the body of Christ works. The good news is that God is still working with us. The good news is that the same differences that sometimes frustrate and annoy us are exactly what God is going to use to convince a doubting world that Jesus' message is real. And not only that it's real, but that it can bring healing and peace to our world. I may have different gifts than you. I may vote differently than you. But Jesus' mission and message of good news is bigger than that. In a world of division and hatred, it's a message of hope and reconciliation. And I'm proud to be on this journey with all of you.